do is welcome everybody to tell you as attendees that your phones are muted. This session is being recorded and will be available on our website, www.godiabetes.org, within a week. And what I'd like to do is go ahead and spend a little time introducing our speaker today. And her name is Bridget Teven Burke. She's a newlywed. And Bridget is an associate researcher at the Robert Graham Center for Policy Studies in Family Medicine and Primary Care. Her research primarily focuses on the primary care workforce, including medical student and resident specialty choices, the rural health workforce, primary care, and behavioral health integration. Bridget is very qualified to speak today. She's earned a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry from Florida State University, a master's degree in International Studies from North Carolina State University, and she is a current Master's in Public Health candidate in Public Health Leadership at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And now, after nearly 5 years at the Graham Center, she has decided to pursue a doctorate degree and will be entering the PhD program in epidemiology at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health this fall. So as you can see, Bridget is incredibly educated, but she's also very practical, and she will be able to give us some very concrete examples about developing research for posters and publications. And again, before I turn this over to Bridget, I'd like to remind all the attendees that your phones are muted and that you need to use either the written chat function or the Q&A and type in your questions, and we will respond to those at the end of this program. Thank you so much, Bridget, for being a part of this webinar, and I'm going to turn it over to you now.
All right, thank you, Susan, and thank you so much to everyone for joining me on this webinar today. As Susan mentioned, my name is Bridget Teven Burke, and I will be speaking today on how to develop research for posters and publications. I'll start off by outlining the objectives for this webinar. First, I'll talk about research in general, including what it is, why you should engage in research, and some of the steps you'll take in conducting your research. Second, I'll talk about writing research abstracts. In this section, I'll give you general guidelines about what a research abstract is and the steps you'll take to write an effective abstract. Finally, I'll discuss research posters. In this section, I'll discuss what a research poster is, how to design an effective poster, and how to present your poster at a scientific meeting or conference. So I'll start by talking about research in general. A dictionary definition of research is that it is the detailed study of a subject, especially in order to discover information or reach a new understanding. You may be wondering why you should do research, given all of your other responsibilities. Research is really about opportunities to improve health, both for your individual patients, but also for patients at large. Research enables us to identify opportunities to improve health by improving care, and the process of research dissemination allows us to share the results we found with others. It also has a wider meaning in that it helps us advance science and contribute to knowledge in general. Your research can add to the evidence base for evidence-based medicine and can help you and others know how to provide the best care for patients. As you start conducting research, you may be wondering how research differs from practice and quality improvement activities. The term practice refers to interventions that are designed solely to enhance the well-being of an individual patient, and these interventions have a reasonable expectation of success. Research, on the other hand, describes an activity designed to test hypotheses, and it is conducted in a way that conclusions can be drawn that contribute to generalizable knowledge. Quality improvement initiatives assess or improve a process or program, or improve performance as judged by established or accepted standards. The main difference between research and practice is really about providing the best care to your patients, while research is about generating new knowledge. Research might not even benefit your current patients, but could affect the patients of others or patients in the future. One of the main differences between research and quality improvement is that, again, research seeks to answer a question that generates knowledge for everyone, while the goal of quality improvement is to improve internal processes. The line between research and quality improvement can sometimes be a bit blurry. Both might involve systematic data collection and analysis, drawing conclusions, and publishing findings. A basic rule of thumb is that if your project answers a question that is generalizable, it is likely research. If you're answering a question about a process in your institution, it might be quality improvement. If you are unsure, you should contact your institutional review board, also known as an IRB, or your independent ethics committee or ethical review board for help. This slide shows a list of steps that can be taken when conducting research. Because every research project is unique, not every step will apply to every project, and the steps don't necessarily need to be taken in this order. Developing a research project can be an iterative process, where you refine your question, hypothesis, and study design several times before you actually start the project. In general, though, when starting research, you'll want to start by asking a question. For example, you might want to ask, are patients with depression at increased risk for diabetic complications? Make sure you develop a question that can be answered with evidence. If your question is too vague, it will be hard for you to draw conclusions. Good research questions are specific about how one thing affects another. Next, you'll want to form a hypothesis. Hypotheses are proposed explanations for a phenomenon, or in other words, an educated guess about what you think will happen based on prior knowledge. Using the research question I just mentioned about depression and diabetes, your hypothesis could be, patients with diabetes and comorbid depression are at an increased risk for diabetic complications. Your hypothesis should be rooted in what you know about the underlying relationships between what you're studying and your outcomes of interest. For example, I could ask myself, what might be the pathways through which depression could lead to complications in diabetic patients? Is there evidence to suggest that one might affect the other? To put this more generally, you should ask, is it possible to explain what I think is happening based on a combination of my clinical experience and a review of the evidence? If your experience and a review of the literature don't suggest a plausible pathway, you might want to consider revising your hypothesis. Next, you'll want to identify the outcomes for your study. Make sure to select outcomes that can be measured. Outcomes can be generic, like emotional well-being or patient satisfaction, but just make sure you have a way to measure them that is grounded in science. For example, if you want to measure a generic outcome, look for a previously validated questionnaire to guide you. Disease-specific outcomes can be easier for clinician researchers to measure, but you still need to get specific about what your outcomes are before starting your study. Using my prior example, I might ask myself, what do I mean specifically when I say diabetic complications? Am I looking for specific conditions? How do I characterize someone as having that condition? And how would I determine if someone did not? Getting specific will help you design a study that maximizes the quality of your results and the conclusions you are able to draw. Once you've developed your question and your hypothesis, and you've identified your outcomes of interest, you'll need to determine which data to collect. It is important to really think through how you'll use data to answer your question. You should ask yourself, who or what is my study population, and what do I need to know about them? How would knowing this help me draw a conclusion about my question? It's good to remember that you don't need to collect data on everything, because not everything that can be measured is useful. Your study will likely be limited by time and funding, but make sure you collect enough data to detect a difference. This is a power estimate or calculation. If you are unsure how to do this, talk to a biostatistician or someone from your institution's research office. It is often hard to go back and collect additional data if you didn't collect enough the first time around. Once you have a question and a good idea of how you'll answer that question, you'll want to write a study protocol. This guides what you do when you conduct the study. It should describe how you'll collect your data and how it will be analyzed. Getting it down on paper helps you see the whole study and helps ensure you didn't forget any important procedures. You will likely revise it several times. It also allows you to share your study with others for their input and guidance, and you'll need a well-developed protocol if you are looking to get your research funded. If you are unsure of whether your project is research or quality improvement, submit your research protocol to your ethics review committee. Even though this will add time to your project, don't skip this step. It is important, especially if you want to publish your findings as research, to make sure you comply with the principles of research ethics. The next step in the process is to collect and analyze your data. You'll want to review the results and spend time thinking about what they mean. It's a good idea to share your preliminary results with others for their feedback. Then you can start writing an interpretation of your findings for others. Try to focus on one major result and one or two minor results when you interpret your findings. If you address too many in one paper or abstract, your message might get lost. Finally, disseminate what you found. Often researchers get stuck on this part. It takes time to write a manuscript or abstract, and there are often many competing demands. Remember, the point of research is to add to the knowledge base for everyone's benefit. So stick with it until you get your research published. In the next section, I'm going to talk about writing research abstracts. An abstract is a very brief summary of your research. It is usually limited to a single paragraph and likely will be limited to 100 to 300 words. A very important point to remember about abstracts is that they must be able to stand alone with the title of your project. This means that if someone reads your title and abstract, they'll have a complete idea about what you did, what you found, and why it's important. Often the abstract is the only part of a research manuscript people will read in its entirety. So you want to make sure it is a concise and complete summary of your research project. The format, sections, and word limits for your abstract will likely be set by the scientific meeting or journal to which you are submitting your abstract, so the elements and requirements can vary. In general, though, an abstract starts with a brief statement of the context or a statement about why you did the research, which is followed by a description of how you did the research. Next, you'll report on the important finding or findings from the study, and finally, you'll state your conclusion. I wanted to quickly mention some important elements of good scientific writing. Effective scientific writing is precise and clear. Some people can try too hard to sound intellectual when they write about research, but good scientific writing does not use extra words or big words just for the sake of sounding lofty. A good rule is just to use plain English. Science can be hard to understand, but good writers make science accessible to a wide audience. I also wanted to mention the difference between active and passive voice in writing. In general, an active voice is the best for writing. An active voice says, "We analyzed the data," whereas a passive voice might say, "The data were analyzed." Sometimes stating something in an active voice adds words to your abstract, and typically every word counts when you're trying to meet your word limits. Sometimes a passive voice can be good for an abstract when brevity is absolutely crucial. I also wanted to point out that you make sure your conclusions are empirically true and logically consistent. This means that your conclusions are based on data and facts that can be measured rather than on assumptions, and that the logic that supports your conclusions is sound. There are two general types of errors that can be made in research. A type 1 error occurs when you find a relationship that really doesn't exist. This is basically a false positive result. A type 2 error occurs when you fail to detect a relationship that actually does exist. This is a false negative. It is a good idea to have several people read and provide some constructive criticism of your work to ensure you draw conclusions that are sound. This slide provides more detail about the sections commonly included in an abstract. You'll want to start by telling why you did the research by stating the specific goals of the study. Keep this to about 1 to 2 sentences to leave room for the other elements. You can include a sentence about the background and significance of your research question. If there's room for this, you want to briefly state what we already know about the problem and the gaps your study addresses. The next section is methods. Here you'll summarize the experimental design in about 2 to 3 sentences. Include a general description of the study type. For example, was it an observational study or a randomized control trial? You should also include information about the population studied and the analytical methods that you used. Next, you'll state the major findings of the study in about 2 to 3 sentences. Briefly and specifically describe what you found. The results you report must relate to your objectives. Make sure you don't state that you wanted to answer one question, but your results actually answer another one. The final section will be the conclusion, which is where you report your interpretation of your findings and implications to the field. You'll want to keep this to about 1 to 2 sentences. Here you should answer the question, why would people want to know this? Here are some general tips to remember when writing an abstract. Follow the guidelines established by the journal or conference, especially headings and word limits. Reviewers do not look kindly on an abstract that doesn't follow the rules. You should use complete sentences and write in plain English. As I mentioned before, your abstract, along with your title, must be able to stand alone. Next, have someone proofread your abstract and provide constructive feedback. Also, don't include bibliographic citations. These belong in a paper, but not in an abstract. Finally, don't use abbreviations, jargon, or other information that will confuse the reader. Make sure your writing can be understood by a wide audience. In the next section, I'll talk about research posters. A research poster is a summary of your research printed in large paper format that you present at a conference or scientific meeting. Unlike a podium presentation, where you have an allotted time with a captive audience, research posters communicate research to non-captive audiences. A room or passageway is usually reserved at a meeting for people to view many posters at a time. They're often displayed in conjunction with some sort of reception or placed in a location where people pass by on their way to other places. In many conferences, the room is loud and crowded. Research posters provide a unique opportunity to engage your audience in conversation and make personal connections with like-minded researchers. But they need to be done well in order to capture the attention of your audience. Like an abstract, research posters tell people what you did, how and why you did it, what the results tell you, and why it's important. Effective research posters catch the attention of passersby, stimulate scientific interest, present research in a brief and succinct manner, and most importantly, generate conversation about your work. The elements that you include in your research poster are flexible, depending on your research topic and the design of your study. Common elements include a title, a list of authors, an introduction, methods, results, conclusions, references, acknowledgments, and your contact information. The title should convey information about your research and also catch people's attention. You should list all authors and include their degrees and institutional affiliations. In the introduction, briefly state why you did the research and why it matters. This is the place to generate scientific interest, so make sure you state this clearly and succinctly. You'll want to include a methods section where you very briefly describe the methods you used. This section can include a flow diagram or figure depicting your methods. I would recommend using graphics instead of text whenever it's appropriate because they are often quicker and easier to interpret. Next, you'll want to report the results of your study. Here you should report your most important findings, and just like in your abstract, these should relate to your objectives and hypothesis. Results can be presented in charts, graphs, tables, maps, or photos. Just make sure you label each one clearly. Next, you'll want to write a conclusion. This is the section where you'll summarize your results and state the significance. It is appropriate to include statements about how your study contributes to the scientific literature, as well as real-world applications. You can also suggest what you would want to do in the future with your research here. I find that including a statement about future direction generates conversation and can sometimes help you find collaborators for your next project. Make sure to include your contact information, which can be an email or website address, or QR code that people can scan if you're more tech savvy. I want to talk here a little about poster design. The design is incredibly important. Your poster will only have about 2 seconds to catch the eye and about 10 seconds to generate scientific interest. In designing your poster, you should consider the size and orientation of the display. These vary from conference to conference. You should look for the specifications outlined in your acceptance or on the website for the conference. Important things to note are, is the orientation portrait or landscape? What is the board size? 4 feet by 8 feet is common, but you should verify this to make sure you get the dimensions correct. Also, your poster doesn't have to fill the entire board. In fact, you should leave a little space around the edges so the poster is readable and not overwhelming to your audience. The layout should include columns that are clearly labeled with section headers. Section headers help the reader navigate the information. Posters are usually designed to flow from left to right, which is the way people read. Before you start, you might want to sketch out your layout on a piece of paper or use a template. There are a number of PowerPoint templates on the internet that can be downloaded for free. You want to make your poster readable from 6 feet away. This is generally 24 to 36 point font. You'll also want to make sure your poster is neat and easy to read. Bullets are generally better than sentences. A long paragraph of information will only be read by the most interested viewer. A lot of text usually makes people pass by. In general, sans serif fonts are easier to read. A good rule of thumb is to stick with 1 or 2 fonts so that your audience is not distracted. One of the most important points is to leave significant white space or areas with no text or graphics. Busy posters are simply too overwhelming for most people, and they will likely just keep walking by. Remember that the most important function of a poster presentation is to generate conversation, where you can go in-depth about your research. Don't be tempted to put it all on your poster. You should save some information for the conversation. The colors you select can make a big difference in making your poster readable. Limit your design to 2 to 3 colors. A light color background with dark text is typically very readable. You can also use a dark background with light text, but sometimes this can be harder to read depending on the colors. Again, this is where using a template can be very helpful. The colors on your poster may not print the same as on your computer screen, especially if you are using PowerPoint. I have noticed that blues especially are inconsistent between the printer and PowerPoint. Finally, you should have your poster printed professionally on a large format printer if this is possible. On this slide, I've included 2 example posters. In the poster on the left, I purposely made almost every common mistake. Notice the red font on the blue background is hard to read. The columns are off, which makes the poster look cluttered. The background is way too busy, and the white font is hard to read. You'll also notice the figures don't have labels, so it would be hard for the reader to make sense of them. Finally, there's too much text and not enough white space. The poster on the right is much better. Notice how much easier it is to read light text on a dark background. There is a lot more white space on this one and less text because several sections use bullet points. This makes the poster accessible to your audience and not overwhelming. The columns are also in alignment, which adds to the appeal. Notice also that the figures are all labeled. By simply changing the design, I've changed the poster from one that people are likely to pass by to one that is likely to generate interest and conversation. Your work is not finished when you send the poster to the printer. Since the goal of the poster is to get people to stop and talk to you, you'll need to prepare and rehearse a one-sentence overview of your research. You'll use this to draw people in. Then you'll want to prepare a brief summary of your entire poster, where you describe your research in more detail. Don't make this too long. You want to generate conversation and not just speak at people until they move on. Make sure you speak facing your audience. You can point to figures on your poster as you talk about them, but don't simply read the text of your poster. Remember that a poster session is a unique opportunity to generate conversation. You might want to also consider printing a legal paper-sized color version of your poster to distribute. You should also have your business card available to hand out. You can either keep them in your pockets, or some people tack them to the board so that people who can't stop to talk can still pick one up. To summarize this presentation about preparing your research for posters and publication, remember that research improves the health of patients by identifying opportunities to improve care. It also advances science and contributes to generalizable knowledge. In presenting your research, you want to tell people what you did, how and why you did it, and what the results tell you, and finally, why it's important. When you write an abstract, make sure that it is a concise and complete summary of your research project. Remember that it must be able to stand alone with your title. Finally, presenting a research poster is a unique opportunity to engage people in conversation about your research at a conference or scientific meeting. Your posters should present a summary of your research in large paper format. To effectively communicate your research to a non-captive audience, your poster needs to be well designed, and you need to be prepared to explain your research quickly and succinctly. And that wraps up my presentation. Thanks for listening, and good luck with your research.
Thank you, Bridget, so much. I apologize for the technical difficulties there. I had difficulty getting the phone off of mute. Wanted to thank everybody for your participation, and to let you know again that this webinar is recorded and will be available within a week on our website, which is www.godiabetes.org. And for those of you who are listening to this in the next week, we do have a research workshop, and Bridget will be presenting at that. And you can also obtain information on our website about that particular opportunity. So thank you so much for participating, and that will end our webinar at this time.